So we're going to keep moving on because I'm being someone who doesn't do a very good job with having a watch, so to keep the time. But the gentlemen up the back are, I think, keeping me in order a fair extent. I'd like the pleasure to introduce our next speaker is Daniel Espinosa, and had the pleasure of meeting Daniel for the first time yesterday and last night, and having a discussion on many other things other than herd improvement, which is always nice to give context of who you're dealing with. So Daniel's going to raise was how can herd testing add more value, but I think one of the things I've found really interesting at the moment, Daniel's the program and project manager at HICO, Herd Improvement Cooperative Australia, Maestro, the herd management software, and other internal developments. Daniel was born in Colombia, where he finished his veterinary medicine degree at La Salle University and worked with the Colombian dairy industry for 10 years. Then he took the opportunity to undertake further research, doing a PhD at La Trobe. All credit to Australian institutes to attract quality people into our country. And since then, Daniel's been working in the Australian dairy industry, mostly in Gippsland, where he and his family are enjoying all the wonderful things that Gippsland has to offer, which are many and varied, and we're very lucky. So I just would like to introduce Daniel to the mic and welcome him accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. It is a tremendous pleasure and a tremendous honor to be here today speaking this crowd. It's probably not my first conference, but certainly the 5 conferences that I have done speaking, so a little bit nervous. Bear with me, please. 20 years ago, two guys brought David Klein and Kevin Rivet published a book about the hidden value that underutilized patents have in certain industries or certain businesses. And the title of the book in that time was called The Rembrandts in the Attic. And I found this a very interesting analogy because they were trying to unlock hidden value on these assets that were not utilized. And they were referring to these assets as that we shouldn't be seeing these assets as just passive property sitting there, but you should be seeing them as strategic assets that can actually be used to gain competitive advantages. Today, we live in a different era. We live in an information era, a knowledge economy. And the assets that we need to unlock sometimes are not anymore the patents like 20 years ago, but we also have a new currency on that front, which is which is data. Herd testing data, in my view, has the first of all, I'm going to divide this presentation in 2 different sections. One is that the 2 ways that herd testing data can actually add value or be one of those remnants in the attic at them, for us. And then I'm going to focus on a proposition that to analyze herd performance using lactation curves. And lactation curves that are calculated based on the herd testing data we already collect. So it's not really nothing extraordinary or new in the sense that the data and everything that we need for doing this sort of approach is already there, is sitting there. So the long history of herd testing, as we saw on the first presentations this morning, is that herd testing data has been collected for over 100 years now. And has been the main objective of collecting this data is been basically as a selection tool in the quest of looking for that improved animal that is going to give us more efficiencies in production. Later on, a few decades ago, then mass studies was also possible to be evaluated using herd testing data, so it became a very strategic mass studies tool as well. And the focus of herd testing has always been on individual animals. And this is how herd testing is sort of adding the value today. So we've got a number of variables that is rather small, and these variables have been developed just basically to selection and health tools, as I already explained. So one of the ways that we can actually add more value with herd testing data is by increasing the number of variables that we can actually provide to the farmers. So remember that this is from the herd testing perspective. How can we add the value from the herd test center perspective? Right now, we have other variables that sort of are in our radar and that we know that we can include into a portfolio to make available for the farmers. However, the developments on these fronts still require a little more research and investigation, and the list is enormous. The amount of pathogens in particular that we can actually measure from the milk is significant, and this is one way. Now, there is another way we can actually add value to herd testing data as well, which is increasing its use. So this is what my proposition is today, is that we can actually use herd testing data to monitor the nutrition status of cows and the performance of the herd. And these two are very, very well linked together. Just a little bit of the performance. Why am I focusing on performance of the herd? Well, it's a very simple equation. Production, milk price is gross income. And production is performance. But the production of the herd is the sum of its parts. So the proposition is that we can actually need to understand and quantify the variation of the parts and understand how that group of cows actually perform. Now, when I say parts, I'm not necessarily referring to individual animals. I'm referring also to subgroups of animals within the same farm. And this will help us, hopefully, to identify strengths and weaknesses in the performance of the herd. As I mentioned before, herd testing has been basically individual animals, and many of you are familiar with this sort of report, which is the list of the animals. It's basically a raw list data. And although the report has a couple of summary tables as well, these summary tables are not necessarily very informative. So when we talk about performance of the herd, the first thing that comes to mind usually is, what's the average? Well, the average by itself means very little. We need to frame it into some kind of context, and that context is basically, the most important context basically is the days in milk. So it gives us a little bit of what stage of the lactation that herd actually is. But that's what all that it is. It's just a dot in a graph. It's not particularly informative. So what if, instead of looking at the dot of that last test to evaluate performance, we open up that dot and then we create something like this? This is more informative. Now, this is the same last test, and this is where that average came from. No, that's not the correct button. That's the correct button. This is where the intersection of these two lines is where the average actually is. But now we can see that in this, by the way, this is a real example. This is a real life farm, commercial farm that sits somewhere in Gippsland. We can see that there are very well-defined groups, calving groups, a few carryovers. But two things also are very important to notice here. One is the relationship between production and days in milk, so we can see that it's downwards. That's why we need to frame the average somehow. And the other one is the distribution within each of these groups. So now the picture is slightly better. But can we do better? Well, we can have the same graph by grouping cows in different, and in this particular example, I'm using the lactation number or the age group to see a little bit of the performance of those groups within the herd and where they actually sit. Now, that is all good, but the problem is that this is just a snapshot of the day of the test. Still not very informative. So What happens if we take a whole year of herd test and put it on the same graph? It looks awful. It's too much data. There's nothing really there apart from the fact that we can actually identify a few things. The first one is, well, the center group. This is what the normal situation is occurring. But we can also see that there are a couple of outliers. And straight away we can see, okay, what's going on here? And this even though it's an awful graph, it's still allowing us to identify that there are some things that are not quite right. And these anomalies are worth investigating. But when we've got a graph like this, we actually can see, okay, where are the trends? And particularly for these three groups of cows, how can we measure the trends? And the best way we can do it is by using lines, not dots anymore. So now we can actually quantify the differences between the groups slightly better. But again, it's a graph that doesn't give us the information that perhaps I'm looking for in order to be able to evaluate performance as such. So one of the things that we need to do is to actually limit the amount of data that comes through, and I decided to go with the lactation, the first 300 days of the lactation. So now I have a more homogeneous group, and now I can start seeing that there is a little bit of a trend in those lines, and that's what a lactation curve looks like. However, we cannot use these lactation curves as the comparisons because it's not fair. We're using yield, and we all know that the yield of the cows vary depending on the composition of that milk. So let's just dial back a little bit and go through the theory of the lactation curve. A lactation curve is an interesting tool because it gives us three main components: the ascending part, the peak, and then the declining part over time after the peak, which is measured by something that's called the persistence. Both the peak and the persistence are very good indicatives as to what is happening with the nutrition of those cows. And then we can actually lie us back that the events of nutrition or events that are happening using the lactation curve. But in order to make the comparisons fair, we need to modify the variable that we're using. And then we create something that's called use something that's called the energy-corrected milk. We could also use the milk solids, for example, and I will show an example at the end of the presentation using the milk solids. But for this next couple of slides, I'm going to focus on the energy-corrected milk. So now I have bring 5 years worth of data in just one graph. That's just too much. Let's clean it up. This looks better. Now we have lactation curves, and we can actually quantify and see the differences between these three groups. And these three groups are just examples of comparisons. We can actually be grouping cows by anything we want: year of calving, season of calving, the performance index is calculated in the herd testing report, breed, or you name it. And any variable that is measured on the farm can actually be used to group the cows and then do the comparisons. But we can also create combination of these factors. Let's have a look at an example. So the previous graph showed 5 years worth of data. So these are those 5 years now compared with each other. And as you can see, well, this is probably a good example in terms that there is not much variation within the years, although you can clearly see that 2019 and 2016 are quite different in years. But you can start also seeing that some years the persistence is better, some years the persistence is lower. So we can start understanding why, or asking the question as to why that might be happening, and what sort of insights we can actually get from there. However, performance of the cows, the picture of performance is not complete if we don't include reproduction parameters. And I just put an example here of these 4 parameters of fertility, just to give us an idea of how can we correlate production and reproduction to get a full picture of performance. As I mentioned, we can actually split, use a combination of factors, so we can actually compare, okay, let me see how the autumn cows and the spring cows behave on those same 5 or 4 years worth of data in there, and of course, we can actually get the reproduction as well. I also mentioned that we can use milk solids. So if you compare this graph with the milk solids one, it's not that different in terms of the conclusions that we can actually draw. So looking at the performance from this perspective can actually help us to understand a little bit how the cows behave and how the cows actually are producing the milk. And of course, the reproduction. So with this, I'm pretty much coming to an end to my presentation. And I would like to say then that lactation curves can be utilized to analyze or to describe the performance of the herd. Now, I forgot to mention something in the slide of the years is that now that we've got this data in this way, I wonder, and after seeing most of the presentations that have happened this morning I wonder to what extent we can start using this data as well to make predictions. Because with all the advances in data science that have occurred in the last few years, it's not uncommon to see that the correlations like days in milk and production can actually now be put into an algorithm that can actually help us predict things based on other variables. So we can actually go there as well. Those lactation curves, or all that information that I just presented there, is based on data that already exists on farm, is sitting there, is being underutilized. And this concept, as I mentioned, well, hopefully it's not just describing what happened in the past, but maybe we can evolve this concept into put it a little bit more on a predictive sort of way as well. So in other words, a Rembrandt in the attic. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have found it informative.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm not sure. if there's a quick question, otherwise I'm going to take advantage of Daniel being ahead of time to square the ledger a little bit, because I started to fall behind, as I've been informed by my friends at the back of the room. So once again, thanks, Daniel, and he'll be here for the next couple of days as well. So I think if there's any one-on-one discussions, please feel free and take advantage of the situation.